again, want to thank you for having me here. This does actually bring back some memories. I was here in 2007 with Bill at the Oxford Internet Institute. We were having discussions about cybersecurity then. Again, in 2010, we were talking about cybercrime, and actually a lot of the similar conversations are happening. It's good that those conversations are broadening, but it does sort of feel like, in some respects, we actually did talk about the car model back in 2010. It was brought up that actually the car, when it occurred about 10 years later, was actually the advent of the rise of, in terms of Bonnie and Clyde, interstate crime, and eventually the creation of the FBI, and that took about sort of 40 years. And so it's worth thinking about, yes, technology is great, but there's always, like everything, it's sort of amoral. It's how us humans use it to determine whether it's good or bad. But I'm here to talk to you about creating a cybersecurity commons. And on there is actually a map of the world. It's kind of hard to see because unfortunately the light's bright, but those were lights from space taken by NASA back in the early 1990s. And it sort of shows you the world as points. What's interesting though is if you compare that, and what you can see as we go to it, is this is actually a map of Facebook friends, and it shows connections. Now what's interesting is what part of the world stays lit and what part of the world disappears. You may notice that China disappears. Russia's kind of a little bit more dark too. Africa is lighting up, but that was actually created about 4 years ago, and I'm sure if it was updated now it would be even more robust. But it's the idea that we're moving from points to connections. And I think that's something that's really key to think about when we look for solutions. We can't look for point solutions. We have to look for connection solutions. And that's not something that we're used to. In fact, policy doesn't really do well with things that span horizontal connections. Policy is actually trying to focus more on a sort of simple connection. So, why does a common matter? Well, in certain respects, the news actually wrote itself for me before I came to this event. This only happened about 3 days ago. US internet service providers had their traffic unwittingly routed through Iceland and Belarus. And that was done using what was called the Border Gateway Protocol. It's one of the frameworks of TCP/IP, and is inherently unsecure, because anyone can publish their gateway routing table. Anyone can claim and say, I'm in the United States and I can handle those connections for you, even if they're not actually in the United States. So this is an interesting challenge that presents itself that I don't think any amount of law will be able to solve. It's actually something that we actually have to think about, how do we solve it connectively? The other reason why is, do you know where your internet traffic is being routed? How many of us can say when you send that message, you may think you're sending it between Oxford and London, but do you know if it's really going to another country before it actually gets to London? Equally, as I said, border gateway routing tables are inherently insecure. Next step. Well, this is again a headline from just a few days ago about the UK talking about the rise of criminals actually using Bitcoin. I've heard some people talk about, well, if we follow the money, non-state actors are actually followed by the money, but now they're actually using a source of money that's very hard for governments to track. And it's not just about Bitcoin. There are now at least 100 different clones of Bitcoin now on the rise too, that make it very difficult to actually follow where the money is going for these activities. And so there's a rise of cybercrime and spear phishing, doing what's called data extortion, where I actually have now infected your system and locked down your data, and if you want it back, you'll need to pay me in some sort of currency. And it's really sort of a 20% human problem. It's not so much a technology problem. And so how do we do that and how do we tackle that? Then also sort of looking at a horizon, there's this sort of ubiquitous sort of Internet of Things. You can look at it in terms of how confident are you getting in that car that's going to drive itself? How confident are you going to be with that pacemaker that's inside of you? How confident are you going to be with that glass that you're wearing, or that watch that you're wearing, or the limb that you're using? Or as we mentioned around here, there are cameras everywhere. How confident that they're only being used by the government to watch what's going on? This is the world we're moving into, where it's going to be these several semi-autonomous devices distributed, some of which will actually be inside of us. How confident are we that they're actually going to be doing what they're supposed to be doing? That's why a commons matters. So, as mentioned, we're going to be connected directly to the internet, and it's actually going to be embodied in us. And what happens when things that are embodied in us can now be attacked digitally? So, how would a commons work? Well, if you think about it, it's that every node on the internet could be a sensor. And it could let you know in near real time, machine to machine, getting humans out of the loop, because if a human's involved, it's too late automatically. Machine to machine exchanges at massive scale as to what's affecting them. Known participants voluntarily will share what's hitting their different nodes in the network, and they can actually share anonymously what attacks they observe. That could be what's hitting their firewall if they choose to share it. It could be what they're seeing in terms of their routing and their traffic. If you think about that, what just happened 3 days ago, ISPs should have seen that their traffic was actually being routed to Iceland and to Belarus. but they weren't watching, and nobody actually had no one to share it to in machine-to-machine time. So it would actually be a place that was a voluntary model, and people would be sharing what's actually they're seeing on their own individual sort of island. As they share that, akin to fire alarms, then when that gets shared, the entire commons can be aware of what actually has happened. So it's a trusted third party that actually does know the participants in the system, but is actually treating it as if it's anonymous information, and is actually allowing these patterns to be shared amongst all other participants in the system. We're all better off if we know what's actually affecting each of us individually. We can begin to look for trends. If you think about what happened in January and February, you may have been following the news, there was a rise of denial of service attacks in the United States. They were targeting specific sectors. Well, those sectors may have actually each individually gone to their ISPs to have additional bandwidth in case they did have a denial of service attack. But what happens if they each contracted with the same ISPs and an entire sector is now being affected? You now have a DDoS that effectively is taking down the entire sector because they can't all provide the additional bandwidth. So it's the idea that we either all hang separately or we hang together. And if you really think about it in cybersecurity, that's what we really need to be thinking about is how can we all be more informed by what's affecting us individually. And then from that, you can actually imagine a future in which you could actually now have real-time longitudinal data, which we currently don't have, of the state of the public infrastructure. What is hitting the .coms? What is hitting the customers? And you can actually run simulations and say, what if we had done this intervention? What if we had done something differently? It would be a great model to actually inform policymakers so we could actually ground what we're saying in data. And you can also then imagine, ultimately, if you actually have some trust in that system, you can actually distribute patches to that system. You could actually have them change their configuration based on the attack surface they're seeing. And again, it would have to be something outside of government. It would actually have to be this trusted commons that involves the public and the private sector. So I'll close with this idea of what would it actually benefit. Well, first, clear the private sector. We know that there is anonymous reporting that could be shared, and so that would actually free them of the concern that if they reveal they've been attacked, that they reveal that they've had a vulnerability, that actually opens them up for a lawsuit. And so in a lot of cases, companies hold back on the attacks that are facing them because they're worried about what that's going to do to their reputation or initial and civil criminal actions. Equally, it would actually benefit the nonprofits. There would be a niche for cyber watchdogs that could look at that anonymous data and see what was going on, sound the alarm. Also, oftentimes, nonprofits can't afford the amount of money it takes to actually have strong cybersecurity defenses. So in this case, by participating in the commons, they benefit from the collective intelligence of all. And finally, and probably most importantly, the public. They could also contribute. They contribute by watching. They could actually choose to download an open source application that would allow them on their devices to share what they're seeing that's hitting them, and at the same time have their firewalls, have their sort of infrastructure be strengthened as a result too. Again, making it open source, so you can sort of relieve any concerns that it's somehow a mysterious backdoor to some government agency. Unless that sounds sort of far-fetched, this is not cybersecurity, but the Federal Communications Commission, we did just release on Thursday of 2 weeks ago, we released an application that anyone can download that 3 times a day it will actually check the speed of your internet connection and then report that to a third party anonymously, which then packages it and can actually produce a map of the United States that's effectively crowdsourcing the speed of internet connectivity across the United States. Now imagine the same thing being used for the purposes for cybersecurity, same thing possibly using for disaster response, because actually if you think about it, digital security and disaster response security is very similar. It's quite possible. So with that said, hopefully this teed up some interesting discussions. I look forward to talking to you each later, and thanks for having me.
So first, I have 2 observations. They're not quite questions, but more comments. We heard that there are some ideas how to automate things so that we can automatically find when there is attack and also to combat those attacks and ideally deploy patches or other remedies to the system. So it might come as a shock to some people, but that is already being done today. And we do have communities who are casually handling multi-100 gigabytes attacks on a daily basis. And it is going on today, right now, and it was going on for the last 5-6 years. So it isn't something that really new. We do have it, maybe it needs to be improved. Another problem with automatically applying patches or remedies. For full disclosure, I used to work for Cisco. I was the guy who was writing security advisories. I was the guy who was talking to ISPs. And the message from them is, they will not apply any patches from any provider or any vendor whatsoever until they test it. So therefore, automation will have to wait. Not because we don't have a technical capacity. It is just not feasible because problems of breaking things. Thank you.
So, sort of to reply on that, agreed, it's not necessarily a new idea. The big challenge is the involvement of the public with those companies. Often those companies may be working on bequest of a few companies and actually working across sectors. And so this is the idea that that third layer of the triangle that's really missing is the involvement of public and then the nonprofit watchdogs, as opposed to just having sort of companies that support each other and actually make it a sort of a partnership.
Yes, at the back.
Sure, so it's actually a question for Bill, but I didn't get any questions after the presentation. Still here? There was a point about trusting governments. Sorry, not trusting government. A question about whether the respondent thought the government was monitoring their communications. Did you ask questions specifically about one's own government versus other governments? Because I know there sometimes is a difference in opinion about which government is involved in monitoring.
No, it was framed government, and I think this was pre-Snowden topic. Very few people were probably. I mean, again, survey research. You never know what people interpret a survey research question to know. I mean, you can't interview everybody about what did you mean. But I think it was applied to their own government, own domestic governmental situation. But whatever way you define it, it was much higher than I would have imagined. Yep.
Okay, we have a Twitter question here, if I can just read that out. Question for David Bray. How is what he proposes possible anonymously? His idea is pretty schmatikov.
And I would agree that actually what you would need is a trusted third party, and so that's where it probably needs to be a nonprofit. It may even be, for example, a global cybersecurity center. Just saying.
Hi, I'm Maria Farrell. I have a question for Professor von Solms. You mentioned there were peculiarly African attitudes to securing information and securing infrastructure. And I wonder, could you just elaborate a little bit on those, and also perhaps why the South African government hasn't involved itself in any practical cybersecurity capacity building measures?
Thank you very much. Can I just start off by making a comment which slipped my mind when I was making my presentation? I showed you the results, this very expensive product that we're distributing among schools. There was only one company that was interested in sponsoring this issue and this project as such, with a lot of money. Thank you very much to Microsoft for providing their input and helping this to go out to the schools. Your question, surely, firstly, I think there's a difference in terms of using mobiles, and already, I think David has already said, we've jumped a generation gap. Our kids and even our people out there working don't go through desktops, so they've got the mobile mentality, call it like that, and the banks, specifically the banks, are aggressively marketing this, which I also think many of the systems that they are marketing mobile-wise are too close to the edge. I've told them that, and they don't like it, but I think that's the fact. We're giving the users something that they are not prepared or not ready to use as such. Culture differences, to a big extent, in Africa, sharing is the important thing. You share with your people, you share your money, you share your whatever you've got. I think there's a much more open aspect, and therefore it's a little bit difficult. Now come and say, you don't share your password. It's part of a culture to share. And I think that's an issue that's very, very important. And that happens to a lot of other things. Another aspect of the African culture, I think, is to trust people. It's a fact. People trust other people. Therefore, I trust the fact, if I give you my cell phone and I give you my logon code, that you will not do something that will compromise me. And I think these are the type of approaches. Therefore, some of the research we're doing is to maybe take some of those decisions away from the end user by making the ISP more responsible for providing security. as far as the government is concerned, I just went, as I said, last Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I went with David and Alex to 6 of the biggest companies. And at 6 companies, the question that was asked, why are the government not moving? Coming from the major banks, coming from the major oil industries, etc. Why are the government not working? If you can get that answer, please give it to me. But I haven't got a clue. I think there are some, again, there may be some reasons. One of the guys opened up a little bit in terms of when we asked him that. Maybe David can react on that. It's a strange issue. And South Africa is suffering, and to a certain extent Africa, because South Africa is supposed to provide the guidance in Africa. So I haven't got an answer. But it's an important one.
Nor me. We asked the question 6 times, as you said. We got no reasonable answer for it. Yes. Sorry.
Two questions. One specific one for David Pollington from Microsoft. This is Neil from the FCO, Neil Chauhan. And the specific question is, with 10, 11 years of experience under Microsoft's belt, are there lessons that we can learn in terms of what has particularly worked and what's not, either as specific cases or general principles that you've developed? And the second question, more broadly for the floor, is if we consider cybersecurity capacity building to be helping each other to develop and protect our physical security, economic security and values in cyberspace, I'm struck that if you knock off the last 2 words of that, in cyberspace, these are challenges that are being faced elsewhere in international development, in counter-terrorism capacity building, in counter-narcotics capacity building. So I'm interested in learning from people about what has worked in other fields outside cyberspace and identifying what is different. And I'd just like to finally put a point forward, which to me, the challenge in cyberspace specifically is finding something that is both sustainable, where we can learn a lot from the international development initiatives, for example, but also scalable. Thank you.
Neil, are we on? Neil, thank you very much for your question. Of course, I'm thinking off the top of my head, and I'd rather we answer this with substance over time, and we connect the right people from our analyst team into the Oxford Centre. But the first thing to say is that what we learn is that it's easy to run an event, it's easy to make an announcement, it's easy to launch something. It's really hard to be in it for the long term and continue to do it. You know, we're in product delivery and evolution over the long term, and we've demonstrated that. And therefore, any initiative that we're involved in has to continue to grow. And I'd happily say, look at our security cooperation program, which had an early peak in the first few years, has had several injections of effort as people have said, oh, we should add this to it. Let's talk about law enforcement, or let's talk about this. And then those things have hived off and become separate initiatives as we engage with different communities. And that's the benefit of it. But honestly, also, we've reorganized recently, and we're taking that back in-house, and we're looking at it and saying, how could it do more? How could it be more useful? How would it change from 80 to 180? And so the lesson really is to continually question. Yes, have a 3-month, 6-month, 12-month plan in terms of what the world's going to see and what's going to come out. Maybe have a 3-year plan, but just assume that whatever you're doing needs to continually change. And the other thing is that we need to be, I would draw out the fact of being relevant. As we've grown over the years, just doing technical documentation, making it available in more and more languages has been really important to us. When I started with the company, doing hard translations, physical code translations of our products into other languages like Welsh was something that was difficult, and we put money and time into it, and we did that. Now, it's completely generic. We've built a language tree into our products. They all go back to source languages. You could replicate a new language if you needed to do so. It's that sort of systematic thinking that is required for an activity of this thought.
Thank you. Next question or comment? Yes, you have one here.
Thanks. Andrea Matuszyn from University of Pennsylvania. My question is for David Pollington. I was wondering if you could take us through the evolution of Microsoft's thinking on bug bounty programs and what you view your role, how you view the relationship changing, particularly with respect to Microsoft's role to the independent researcher community on the international scale, the evolution of gray, black markets and exploits, and how do you see that relationship of the governmental role the corporate sector and the realities of InfoSec dovetailing? Just a little question.
Wow, thank you for the best question of the day and the worst question. Everybody else doesn't have the time that we would need to answer that question, so I'm going to pick a few highlights and follow up with you later if that's all right. Just in case anybody doesn't know, the bug bounty programs that we've launched recently are very specific and very focused and very different to others around the community. So, in reality, I'm trying to remember the organisation that started it, but about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a move to start to pay for bugs. And the market started to change. A company that was providing a perimeter defense decided that it would start to buy these things. Tipping Point is the first name that comes to mind. They may not have been the first, but they come to my mind. And they created a marketplace in saying, oh, actually, you don't just give it in for free and hope that Microsoft gives you a credit at the end by saying, you know, good job, well done, you know, we give our credits to this person. That was a shift which we stood back from, and we've stayed back from it. Our bug bounty program is a way of saying, not just give us a bug and we'll pay you anything for any bug you can find, or it's got to be a real security one, we pay more for the real security ones. We've focused on our own products and said, actually, right back in the days of Vista, when we made Vista and put it into the world, our security team blocked its existence in the world for 6 months, whilst we contracted 30 people from the outside world, security researchers, to work with us and test and break that thing. And then we fixed all that stuff before we released it to the world. Vista's not the greatest version of Windows, but it was one of the security huge steps that we made. And since then, we've learned to work with this community. I really welcome the fact that you introduced them as stakeholders, because in a different presentation I talk about in terms of norms of behaviour in the internet for international security, I think they're an unconsulted group. So it's very important that they're brought in. But out of respect for them, it's also very important that we don't talk to them in a financial way. Yes, there are reasons for bounties. Yes, there are discrete programs that will help a product go through. But if we start to reduce that to the transaction of how much will you pay, what is that commodity, it takes all of the intellectual content out of it. And we need to make sure that's a proper stakeholder discussion with that particular community. I could go on and on, as you can tell. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks. We had a question right here.
Also a question. Okay, I'm not sure if this is working.
So we'll try to spread the questions so we're not picking on Microsoft too much.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, this is actually one more Microsoft-related question. So in your presentation, there seemed to be kind of 3 big messages that I took across. One, we've been talking about this for way over a decade. Same things keep coming up. Number 2, there's an arms race that's been going on, and you guys have been running it, and it's proved to be fairly manageable as long as you keep innovating. And number 3, because it's manageable, there is just tremendous opportunity remaining in this space. So that's an incredibly copacetic story that definitely contrasts a lot with you know, the threat rhetoric that we hear from policymakers and whatnot. So am I interpreting that correctly, or are there some big things that Microsoft needs help with?
So to answer your question backwards, we will always welcome help. That's what I was trying to make the point with in terms of security research community. The world is bigger than us. We have one product in one space. It's a small layer. We thrive by collaboration. That's the way our business model works. And so in no sense do I want to imply that we don't need any help and we don't want to help, because we want to help and we want to collaborate. But standing back from that, you know, yes, we've had a lot of progress. Yes, we've learned a lot of things as we've gone through that process. But each time we learn, what we realize is that you have to move to this wider shell of collaboration and bring in different interests. And do you know what? I'm reconstructed. I'll be honest with you. I'm fed up with doing threat presentations. I could get all the data, I could scare people, I could tell you what happened this weekend. Why would I do that? Why does anybody need to be scared into taking action? Because it's apparent from what we heard this morning, everybody should be aware. They know where they can go to. They can go to an AV company, they can come to Microsoft, they can go to an independent researcher and find out the true story behind this particular threat. They can understand at what level they want to defend themselves based on what level of capability they have today, and that's a march. I welcome the Oxford maturity model, which I hope they'll talk about at some point today, because finding the position in that and providing the relevant guidance is the appropriate thing. In some places, you will only get people's attention by threatening them, in the sense of saying, I'm sorry, but do you realize how exposed you are? Here are the threats around you, and you appear to be doing nothing. That type of scaremongering, I hope, has had its day. I don't want to do it anymore. And that's why I've taken a more optimistic position that says, let's assume we know everything. And when somebody realizes that they don't know the same things that we're talking about in this room, they take us to one side and say, I'd like to learn that thing because I want to get up to that level and move more. So I'm inherently an opportunist, and I want to create a rising tide rather than this fear and doubt which dissuades people from using cyberspace.
Professor Kreese.
Actually, as a change of tack, this is not a question for the panel. You can stand down. I just wanted to look the other way into the room, because this session is about what works and what doesn't. And of course, you are all aware that this wasn't an open registration event. Everybody was invited because we felt you had something real and interesting to contribute to this debate. And I was wondering if there's anyone in the room who has some burning experience on what works and what doesn't work that they would like to share with us.
I think I jumped the queue as a result of that question because there was someone before me. But I was going to make the point, actually, before Sadie asked that question, that it may be the case. I think one of the messages that came out of the presentations was a sort of sense that South African government's a bit complacent and that maybe companies are not doing enough to work out where their risks lie, and that maybe we need a slightly different model for sharing information on this. If everyone else out there is complacent about it, actually there are a handful of companies who are not complacent about cyber security. In fact, most of the companies involved in cutting-edge research in this area, like my own, spend an awful lot of time thinking about how they can improve the security of data transmission in the digital world. And, you know, I think as a figure that's often quoted, that the problem is only 20% technology and 80% people. But actually, that 20% technology is crucially important. It's growing. I do sometimes wonder whether, you know, more could be made of that in South Africa or in countries which have not really latched on to this issue as an issue of public policy or awareness.
If I could take a shot at that first. We have to remember that half of the country's GDP comes from small and medium businesses. So this comes from SMBs, not companies with huge security resources to do this. The second thing you mentioned is that 20% of the solution relies on technology, and I'd agree with that. But we need to do something about the 80%. It's not like we can't manage these people in a way that helps us with that, bring that 80% down. And if we do, I think we're failing as managers. We're not managing those people effectively. So I agree with your points, with the exception of the fact that I don't think we can rely on technology for the SMBs who quite reasonably aren't aware of these things because they don't have the resources.
Yeah, can I just comment on that too? That 20% you referred to is quite true. But if we look at Africa and we look at some of the statistics, then most of the software in Africa, with all due respect to Microsoft, is illegal. It's not licensed. So it's not patched. So, and that's not an excuse. It should not be an excuse. But the excuse is, look, we haven't got money to pay for that. So we get illegal software. We can't afford to have our antivirus packages updated. Therefore, my contention is we need another model. We need another way of protecting the end user, which is not the normal model. Not saying update your operating system, get the latest operating system, get the latest patches, get the latest antivirus. There must be other ways. And one of the ways that we're looking at very clearly is to move that responsibility. I've said it. If you have a sort of a scale of financial scale of equivalence, in the sense that, and in some countries it's happening, that the government actually supports ISPs. The government provides financial support to ISPs to provide a wider level of security. And eventually in Africa, my vision is that anybody should be able to link onto the internet going through some trusted third party ISP, call it what you want, that takes that responsibility. But that's not necessarily a model that needs to work in the developed world. But you're quite right, the human side is the biggest side. And we talked about the trust. But don't forget, even if we've got a 20% technology side, it's different in that area. And we have to provide something like that. You can't just say, you must get it.
But I think it's a very appreciated comment that 80% of the problem is on the human side.
That's a fact.
I just want to make a very quick clarification. Where a piece of Microsoft software is pirated and we can reach it, we will patch it. The patching is not conditional on licensing.
Ivan.
I don't know if I need a mic or not. I'm pretty loud anyway. So,
You do, I think, for the internet audience.
Oh, sorry. Well, I just
Can
wanted
we
to
get-
say.
Maybe you can wait until I'm done.
Points together is, all right. So a lot of these points together is something Andrea mentioned earlier about the flaming river. This may have to do with culture too, because how you get things done in a country and in a polity often depends on sort of a mid-level of entrepreneurs we tend to call politicians, right? So you're not going to get policy if you don't have advocacy for it, right? In other words, if you don't have basically a demand for policy change, you're not going to get anybody standing up there and saying, well, we need policy change, right? They're not going to get the votes for it. So it's a very simple sort of observation that Andrea's flaming river thing is a reference to an environmental disaster, which did then sort of panic people into seeking remission from their congressmen, getting laws passed that ultimately changed the environment. And one of the difficulties and one of the reasons why we see so much complacency in governments, or might be, I would speculate, is that so many of the costs of cyber crime, cyber damage, cyber threats are invisible. They sort of live there under the surface, and we as a community see them all the time, and it kind of freaks us out. But the average everyday person on the street doesn't even know that Barclays has just been hacked, because their account is sort of seamlessly taken care of as a result of that. So unless there is a flaming river, it's going to be very difficult to sort of get that middle level of politicians to sort of stand up and say, okay, we really need to take this really seriously, because everybody can just either deny that they've been hacked or that the threat is real. And I would just say that's sort of hopefully squares the circle.
Let me get a response here.
So in response to Basie and yourself, I really hope that we can save, if you talked about the developing world leapfrogging the developments we've had in the developed world, I really hope we can, because what's happened in the developed world is really in a way quite, the development's not gone in a good way.
Yeah.
It's quite scandalous, and I'm sorry, David, have to really strongly object to say, like, if only we could make people toe the line. We wouldn't have a security problem, right?
If only we could make people
yeah, when you
toe
say
the
like
line.
80% of the cybersecurity problem is a people
I don't mean
problem.
toe the line.
But it is very often that's the way of how in corporate environments and in company customer relationship it's interpreted. Now, I just wanted to highlight that actually I think the problem is, and a group of researchers think the problem is really that security's just gotten completely out of hand. That what's required, what you need to do in order to be secure is just disproportionate and far too disruptive to people's everyday lives, to the productive activity in organizations. And I haven't heard that said today. It's like the kind of security we need can't eat all the profits of our productive activity. It can't eat up all the time that people have for their spare time activities or for things they want to do for education, whatever. And I think what I would really hope we can leapfrog for the development.
So if I could just answer this point, since you mentioned toe the line, I absolutely don't mean this.
Okay, good.
What happened, and I think it's what happened, for example, with safety years ago, wasn't telling people, toe the line, otherwise you're fired. That didn't happen. What happened was, progressively, a culture was built in which it was seen in mutual interest that we work on this together. And that's my hope for cybersecurity. It's in our mutual interest to work on this together, progressively, over time, rather like Toyota did with its manufacturing systems, but certainly not something where you say, do this or you're fired. That's completely counterproductive.
Thanks, I'm glad we agree.
Can I just comment quickly on what Angela says, and I totally agree with you. Let's just go back to what David has said. The problem is that many of the mobile phones do not use Microsoft. That's a totally new issue. And the Android market is a big problem, because that's where we're going. And this leapfrogging, I think that's core to what we're talking about. And we must take that into account in trying to find solutions. And we must find solutions from the mobile. Forget about desktops. Forget about tablets. Forget about laptops. They're not relevant, or they're very little relevant, and they're going to get less relevant let's start thinking about solutions for the mobile market. And that's not necessarily Microsoft, although they're doing a lot of work.
And I do want to sort of, well, one, I want to say that, make a note, if you're ever on a panel with at least 3 Davids, it's going to be very lively, but separate from that. Your point about making sure it's something that's sort of baked into what they do is well taken, and I think that's as the internet becomes much more ubiquitous in what we're doing, how can we bake in security and privacy by design becomes a very key point for everybody.
And by work design. Yes, someone, a gentleman at the back.
Yes, Michael Mainelli from Zien. Good afternoon. I was interested to hear this discussion about towing the line, managing people, and yet we can't spend an infinite amount. I was very interested to hear the gentleman from South Africa introduce finance. And we started off this morning with an analogy to do with automobiles. In the City of London, the financial district, we have a discussion going on, something called cyber reinsurance, which is really to inject a lot of the market discipline that's needed in here so that people understand that the amount of security that they take on gets them a compensatory risk obligation, which is being taken on by the insurance industry itself. This is injecting market forces, I think, to allow you to do some of these types of cost-benefit equations. There are examples. Insurance in the United Kingdom in 1992-93 dried up due to terrorism, the St. Mary Axe bomb and the Bishopsgate bomb. And in between, the government set up something called Pool Re, which took on physical reinsurance risk. We've seen similar things after 9/11. And I'm curious what the panel might think about really injecting the discipline that manages to get us all on the road safely, which is that we adhere to what our automobile insurer does, and we consider it a crime. When your neighbor says, oh, I thought I'd do without seatbelts, you say, do you realize your policy might be invalidated? What would these approaches do to put some reality into this conversation? Thank you.
I want to at least say from the perspective from those of us in the States, those conversations have been had, because the nice thing about insurance is it does force people to actually start doing measurements and start having audits, and it actually does allow the CEO to understand what are they getting as they add more security in terms of the trade-off for what the company might have down the road. So actually I would say that's definitely a fruitful line of discussion to consider.
I just want to, as the business person, wholly disagree with the idea of cost-benefit analysis. This is something that is the first level of attack for a manager. The reality is both costs and benefits are dynamic. They move all the time. One of the difficulties we have, aside from cost-benefit, one of the difficulties we have in security is convincing people that there is sustainable competitive advantage from this. That's different than cost-benefit, which is going to change all the time. And it is true that you have to audit companies, and this is kind of the first level of stuff that you have to do, but it's by no means the source of long-term viability of a company.
Okay, and I wanted to add a different perspective from the point of view of, I don't know about the insurance side, but I welcome the risk assessment and risk management. That's what's missing. There's a lot, there's nowhere near enough cybersecurity risk assessment and management going on. People continuously complain about Microsoft updates and the fact that that breaks their systems. And nobody ever asked the question, well, when was that system made? Do you still have the people who wrote it? Exactly what is it used for? And so if that could be introduced by whatever mechanism, such that anybody responsible for a company was responsible for the state of support and update of all the software, not just a few moving parts, then I think it would be a big step forward.
Yes, gentleman at the front here.
Oh, there's a question already over there.
Oh, you got a question already over here, who's close to the microphone, which gives you preference.
Ah,
there we go. You're very close to the microphone.
Yeah, extremely close. Mike Levy from Cardiff. Yeah, I agree with Dave Upton's response there. I think you have to see it as dynamic. And perhaps one might all even integrate that with Bill Dutton's earlier papers and say costs and benefits for different segments of the population, not just for the official security managers. And in a way, one of the takeaways that I've got from this afternoon, I was on a flight to get here this morning, so I missed that. But I think it may be a mistake to think of cybersecurity as a holistic construct. I'm sure Sadie and others don't. But there's so many different components, and we really need to segment cybersecurity so that it doesn't become just like national threat.
Thank you. Let's take one more question. We can probably take two. So one from Bill.
Thanks. Robert Hercott from British Telecom. On the risk issue that's just raised, I think that's critical. First of all, human beings are inherently bad at risk analysis. So most people assess flying as a dangerous activity, whereas cycling they think is safe. You know, the odds are about 1,000,000 to 1 against. And the same with terrorism. You know, your odds of being struck by lightning are higher than a terrorist attack. So we're just inherently bad at risk assessment, and particularly in the cyber domain, where the signals don't exist. We didn't evolve to read the signals from a virtual domain. Therefore, we have zero ability to assess risk in cyber, and that's inherent.
So I would completely agree with it. You can overcome that by visualizing, and so there's some fun infographics you can find on the web that show exactly you're much more at risk by driving a car than flying a plane. And so what we need is the ability to actually visualize what are the risky behaviors on the internet that we should be concerned of.
There's a good academic book on this, by the way, called The Science of Fear, which outlines exactly the things that you're describing with empirical examples.
I just wanted to make one final point. I agree with the assessment that you made by comparison, but I would disagree fundamentally that we have zero ability, because many of us have quite a lot of ability. What exists is a very broad spread zero will. There is a lack of will.
You have ability, they don't.
They have the ability, they just have no will to do it, and no appetite.
My question was when we invoke government to do something about it, who in government? And my sense is that it's awfully fragmented in terms of government response. Is there any new thinking about where cybersecurity belongs? I mean, for example, should the communication regulator do this as consumer protection, or is there any new thinking around who's in charge here in government?
At least when I was trying to pitch the commons idea, I would say you start at a national level because that's easier. International gets a lot harder. And it really does need to be something that's outside of government, as a public-private partnership that's involving academia, that's involving nonprofits, that is involving for-profits, and then most importantly, members of the public.
Okay, at this point I'd like to thank my panelists for joining in with us. I apologize a little bit for foisting my strong opinions on you as chair. But thank you very much for some great questions, and it's time for our break. Thank you.